senses of what's working and what's just popular. So, as you may have guessed, psychotherapy with older adults is a big chunk of what I do. And we used to always have to start off arguing about whether therapy with older adults worked or not. And it's actually kind of interesting because really early on in the invention of psychological therapies, people started working with older adults. There's case histories going back at least to the very early 20th century. There's a little discussion about one case even that Freud wrote up, because he never quite says how old the woman was, but she says that she was postmenopausal and no longer young. So he may have even said that. Freud actually said two things early on in his advocacy for psychoanalysis, talking to the Vienna College of Medicine, one of which people have quoted a lot, and the other one, which probably has somewhat more merit, usually doesn't get brought up. The one that he gets quoted on all the time, people talk about this being why therapists were ages for that reason. Most of the century thereafter is that so everybody knows that older adults are too rigid and set in their ways, and you can't teach them anything. It's sort of the 19th century Austrian version of you can't teach an old dog new tricks. Which we clearly know that's not true. And actually, does anybody have a guess as to how old Freud was talking about?
40, 45.
Anybody different than 40 or 45?
I'm hoping closer to 60. I'm just hoping.
Not much. He said at or about the age of 50. Because your brain just sort of freezes up. And you can't
I still have time.
He didn't say the freezing up part, but he does quite clearly say that. The interesting thing about this is that Freud was over 50 when he said it. And he went on to revise psychoanalysis about 3 times from then until his 80s. So he actually was advocating actually a revision that encouraged people to think of there being a death instinct as well as a life instinct that he was arguing for post-World War I, and as he was getting into his 80s, which certainly didn't go anywhere in the U.S. In Europe discuss that.
So a death instinct, like you can sense when someone's going to die or something?
No, that you actually had that there was people had a primary instinct not only to life and to build things up, but also to tear things down. Previously, they had argued that aggression came out of the life instinct being frustrated. So you got frustration, aggression kind of hypothesis. But after the major wars, and maybe as they got closer to death himself, sort of argued that actually people also had a desire to tear things down and a competing desire for death. History, Freud. Certainly Carl Abraham in the 20s explicitly wrote about therapy working with younger adults. And then ever since then, I think, maybe it's only because I hang around so much with Gero people nowadays, I haven't heard anybody in the United States explicitly argue that therapy doesn't work with older adults. Been quite a long time now, although people sort of act like they believe it sometimes. Yeah.
I remember reading something recently by someone at the University of Tennessee, Nehemiah, about inefficiency, or how actually grief therapy was actually bad for older adults. But it was later countered, but I don't know what happens.
Grief therapy is an interesting case because there's not a lot of evaluative work on grief counseling and grief therapy models, and my take on the reviews that I've seen is that it's more effective if you wait a couple, 3 months to see what's happening. That there actually seems to be some indication that if you get newly widowed people into grief counseling, that it actually may make things worse. Not unlike some of the work on crisis debriefing sorts of approaches. That there's a certain amount of evidence that there is a sort of natural coping process, and that it's the people for whom that doesn't work that counseling therapy interventions are effective with, and if you actually do the counseling things that are effective, if you wait with people too soon, that makes things worse rather than better. It certainly makes a certain kind of sense. But I think prevention can be tricky for those kind of reasons. There are some times when things that make a lot of sense to do with a selected group of people may not be good for less selected groups of people. Yeah.
I know we discussed this before, but I don't remember what's D again.
Back on track.
No, I mean, I think we talked about it
Yeah,
early
on
in the
in the
semester, but I don't
semester,
remember
yeah.
what it means.
These are measure of effect size. In the case of measuring outcomes of interventions, it is usually the change, either the post-test scores of the therapy group minus the control group divided by either the control group standard deviation or pooled standard deviation, or probably even more commonly it's the change scores subtracted and then divided by the standard deviation. So roughly speaking, you can think of these in terms of what number of standard deviations or what proportions of standard deviations they measure. And people have kind of somewhat different metrics, but something like 0.2 to 0.4 is a fairly common effect size. We consider kind of small, but not terrible, I suppose, if it's reliable. Something around 0.5, 0.6, sort of, something like 0.4 up to 0.6 is kind of medium, and then 0.7 and higher tends to be considered large on average. And then people have thrown around other standards. I think people kind of backed off of this, but for a while people were arguing that it had to be above 1 to be clinically important. I haven't seen that in a long, long time. Mostly now in terms of clinical importance, people talk more about like what percentage of people still have the diagnosis that you start with, rather than framing it in terms of effect sizes.
So then when you look at that, is that saying then it's clearly, amazing impact for younger adults and mixed age samples, psychological therapy, whereas for older adults, it's
older
good,
adult
but it's
ones
not
you can think of as
outstanding.
large. And actually, most of what people have written about it, including Scoggin and McElwee, tend to compare the effect sizes for older adults with the similar effect sizes that have been reported in meta-analyses for younger adults. But the Lambert and Bergen citation is from the chapter, the Handbook of Psychotherapy and Behavior Change, where they summarize in a table meta-analyses of cognitive behavior therapies with younger adults and some mixed age samples. And they get a pretty wide range of the
Is that 65 or 6.5?
0.65.
Oh, point. Oh, I thought
Up
it
to
said 65.
2 no, nobody gets 65.
Yeah, that's why I made it. Oh, thank
Not
you.
even close.
Okay.
I guess the dot is sort of like right in the
Yeah, it's right there.
line.
So I thought it seems to have been. Okay, thank you.
There are some, if you cognitive macro